As Donald Trump's disastrous war in Iran continues to escalate, he continues to destroy our economy. The markets are crashing. People can't afford things. But Donald Trump says, I thought it was going to be much worse. When I went on this excursion, when I did this detour, I was actually expecting that gas prices would be higher, that more people would lose their jobs, that things would become even less affordable. So I'm actually very happy where things are because things are absolutely great right now. Well, let's dig into the data. In addition to gas prices that are absolutely soaring and people already couldn't afford groceries or anything, when Donald Trump's lie during the campaign was, I will bring down prices on day one. He also said that he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours after the election. And now he's created essentially what looks like World War III, or at least a war involving the entire world as the Putin invasion of Ukraine rages on. And now we have apparently members of the Russian Duma being invited like VIPs by MAGA Republican Congress members who are getting tours of the Capitol building while Russia supplies Iran with ballistic missiles and Shahed drones to kill Americans, and also logistical support to kill Americans, and satellite imagery as well. But just look at like the U.S. bond markets, which impact mortgage rates and borrowing, the interest that we pay on Treasury notes. And by the way, do you think in the future that lots of foreign countries, whether it's the Middle East or otherwise, are going to be rushing to buy American treasuries right now after this little excursion? If Trump's trade war against the world wasn't enough. Just look right here. The U.S. bond market is in big trouble. Hours after Trump claimed that there was a 10-day pause on strikes on Iranian power plants, yields are at their highest level of the Iran war yet. Donald Trump's ability to try to manipulate the market, which he's been doing, the ability for him to move it in dramatic ways and for longer periods of time, I think are starting to decrease as people are getting numb by it. Remember early this week, there was that $1.5 billion movement of S&P insider trading, also people shorting oil right before Donald Trump made a fake peace announcement on Monday. But, you can fool me once, you can fool me twice, or we can be in on the scam together once, twice, three times, or whatever it is. But it seems that the market's like, this is what you do now all of the time. And to me, it's very reminiscent of this exact same time period during Trump's first term, exactly 6 years ago during COVID, when he would pull the like a miracle, it's going away, we're bending the curve. By Easter, it's all going to be done. Everything's going to be great. But I digress. So the 10-year note yield is up to 4.47%, with mortgage rates hitting a fresh 7-month high. You look at the 30-year yield, which gets close to 5, and it kind of, hangs out right around 5. The 2-year note yield is up to 4%, up nearly 60 basis points since the Iran war began. The NASDAQ is officially in correction territory, down 10% from its October 2025 high. You look at the other indexes, and they're all, doing very poorly as well. Donald Trump claimed that he was the Bitcoin president. Well, his Bitcoin czar recently resigned, and they basically crashed Bitcoin over this past 6 months. Bitcoin was down like 40%. That's like Great Depression numbers. No one's talking about that, but their whole thing was, we're the Bitcoin presidency, down 40% like in the past 6 months. But the way this guy, Adam Kobayashi, I think frames the issue that the Fed is facing is, I think, important to note right here. The Fed's worst nightmare is materializing in front of our eyes. What is often overlooked is that the Fed primarily controls demand side inflation, not supply side inflation. In other words, it can influence how much people borrow and spend, but it cannot directly increase supply, like producing more oil, or more helium, or more fertilizer, or more liquefied natural gas. This means that in the case of a supply side shock that we're seeing now with the energy prices and with all these other things I mentioned, the Fed often has to overcompensate on the demand side to contain inflation and vice versa. So during the pandemic in 2020, this meant effectively cutting interest rates to zero as lockdowns triggered a sharp collapse in demand alongside widespread supply disruptions. With oil and gas prices skyrocketing, our models suggest inflation is set to rise towards 3.5% or 150 basis points above the Fed's long-run target. target. I think that's being generous. My own view, I think that's probably going to be closer to 4.2%, 4.5%. We'll see. In a vacuum chamber, this means the Fed should tighten policy and theoretically hike rates. However, the issue becomes the fact that the U.S. labor market is objectively at its weakest point in years. I think that's being generous. I think it's decades. And it has not improved despite recent Fed easing. Therefore, if the Fed hikes interest rates now, the U.S. positioning itself for a full-blown labor market crisis. On the flip side, if the Fed does not tighten its policy stance, U.S. CPI inflation could potentially even exceed 4%, depending on how long the Iran war persists and how long the post-war recovery takes. In a sudden turn of events, the Fed is now forced to pick between 3.5% inflation or 5% employment. And now we're seeing lots of models predicting interest rate hikes coming soon if you were to follow the Fed's basic model. I want to bring in Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle, chairs the Budget Committee. It's great to see you, Congressmember Boyle, as always. These are issues that you and I have been talking about and really getting in the weeds to, because on Budget, you see this stuff every single day. And you and I have done videos where we talked about how Donald Trump would claim, I've brought in $18 trillion and $22 trillion. And it was all a fugazi and it's all a farce. But what we do know, while we're not bringing in that money, we do know what we're spending, and money that could be going to healthcare, hospitals, helping the American people get better education, money going to American people directly. It's going now to this disastrous war. So I want you to reflect on this moment from the perspective of Budget going forward. Where do we go from here? What's going on?
You just very succinctly and effectively laid out the case why we are in real trouble right now on the economy. It's the reason why when they measure public sentiment in terms of their views of the economy, the lowest figures now that we've seen in 20 years. The last time we've seen figures this low is the Great Recession. The reason why, well, you talked about a lot of this. Inflation high and rising when, of course, it was expected a year ago at this point it would be falling. We also have a completely jobless economy. Literally, the entire first year Donald Trump was president, basically no jobs created. And we're awaiting the latest data on the most recent month, but we're probably looking at job losses and an economy with a greater than 50% shot of heading into recession. Gas prices, exactly 1 month ago from today, the national average was $2.98 for a gallon of gas. Today, as we speak, the average nationally is $3.98 a gallon. At no other point in history can you find a $1 a gallon gas increase in a matter of just a month. So this situation is bad. It's getting worse. And we have a president who, frankly, really only cares about putting his signature on currency and illegally etching it onto the Kennedy Center and building his big, beautiful ballroom, and frankly, couldn't give a shit about the American people.
The estimates of what we're spending on this war seem low. I mean, they're big numbers. Let me be very clear. $1 billion, $2 billion a day, $50 billion or maybe $60 billion, whatever it is. That's it. I mean, I think that they're understating what it is. I think the number's actually far higher because this is what Donald Trump does. He lies to increase things when it's lower, when that benefits himself. And then he lies and says they're lower than they are when they're actually higher when it suits his. By the way, that's exactly what his New York fraud cases were basically about, was that he would inflate things in certain situations and decrease them in certain situations to suit his needs. That's why we focused and tried to give everybody the warning on those character issues, because those are transmuted here now to the way our government behaves. And don't get me started. I could go every branch and show you how his deranged personality transmutates onto all of them and results in destruction to our country. But here, from a budget committee standpoint, what are you seeing in terms of the actual cost? Because I think they're understating what's really happening.
I actually was, as far as I know, I believe I was the first elected official to come out within the first 24, 48 hours of this incursion, or as President Trump puts it, excursion. And somewhere in the media, the $1 billion figure had been bandied about. And I said I thought that was way off, that the figure was probably closer to $2.5 billion. There have been other estimates looking at just the first 13 days worth of costs that put it somewhere upwards of almost $30 billion. But I want to put these numbers into context, because for most people, what do these numbers mean? $1 billion, 30 billion, a trillion. These are unimaginable sums. So let me put it in proper perspective. We talked some months ago over the fight that Democrats were waging here in Congress to renew the tax credits for all of those who are on the Obamacare exchanges. And Republicans said, no, we couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford it. To fully extend those tax credits and save the health care of millions of Americans, the full cost per year of that was $27 billion. Already, over the last few weeks alone with this Iran war, we have spent at least $27 billion. So that's the choice, right? It was either wage a war in Iran or instead use that money to extend the tax credits that saves the health care of literally millions and millions of Americans. This administration chose to go down the path of war, which was unnecessary, rather than saving the health care of the American people.
Right. And so spend this money on the war, which then also now has led to all of the things I mentioned at the beginning, whether it's now people's mortgage rates going up, the gas prices going up. We should, of course, focus on the human loss of life, both in the region and, of course, our soldiers who come home in American draped caskets while Donald Trump wears a hat and then uses it the images to fundraise off it. But not only the cost in terms of the capital outlay for the war, but if you look at the trillions of dollars lost in the market. But to me, I never want to just focus on that, because that's not what most Americans are feeling. But the cost at the pump, the cost of groceries, the cost of everything now is even higher than before. So it's had the added effect of taking money that could have been delivered to the people and then screwing people even more by creating supply shocks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's the direct costs, right, which is the amount of money that we have spent from the Treasury specifically to fund the Iran war that DOD has spent on this, which is tens of billions of dollars, as I just mentioned. But then you are correct to point out, hey, wait a minute. Those aren't the only costs. They're also the indirect costs, which is paying significantly more at the pump for your gasoline now than you were a month ago before this war started. There's the higher interest rates, which means a higher mortgage rate, higher student loan rate, higher car loan rate. So when you combine the direct and indirect costs, this is really damaging to an economy that was already teetering, an economy that was already stuck in neutral and headed into reverse. This is, I believe, and I trust a number of analysts who I confer with, this is probably the thing that is now tipping us into recession.
I want to talk also about Russ Vought, the head of the OMB, Office of Management and Budget. So for 15 months, the guy who runs the Office of Management and Budget, who's been doing all of these disastrous things and these massive cuts, and he's the architect behind Project 2025, has refused to testify before the Budget Committee, to which you're the ranking member. I mean, that's kind of unprecedented,
Right.
You show up, you show up every few months, right? I mean, and you give updates. So you've been kind of shaming him. I saw the missing in action milk carton that you were holding up. And then he responds to you, and it's such like a Trumpian sociopathic response. He's like, I'm coming to testify on April 15th. You should get up to speed. Like, just for anybody who has like a sociopath in their life, like that's sociopath 101, which is like, you didn't know that I was going to be there in the first place. It's like, okay, that's not what happened. You avoided talking to me.
Which he wasn't, by the way. That was totally made up on his part. Look, public shaming works. So I had the idea, and this was a callback from when I was a kid. I remember, when you had certain missing persons, they put their face on the side of a milk carton. So I said, all right, after 15 months, let's do this with Russ Vought. And sure enough, before the hearing was even over, he tweeted, oh, I'm coming on April 15th, which had not been scheduled or even talked about. So I'm glad that public shaming worked. And, my point that I raised in the hearing is, what is this guy afraid of? Why isn't he testifying? If you've done a good job, surely you want to come forward and brag about the great numbers and the great job you've done. So perhaps he's so afraid to testify because he's going to be asked about all of the illegal impoundments, including disaster relief to 44 states. He's going to be asked about all of the DOGE nonsense, which achieved absolutely nothing except for causing real damage to our federal government. He'll be put on the record about this Trump economy, which is a jobless economy right now. Inflation is on the rise, gas prices through the roof, and a budget and a tax plan they passed last summer that cuts healthcare for 15 million Americans, according to CBO, will lay them off their healthcare plans. But it does fund more than $5 trillion worth of tax cuts, mostly going to the top 1%. So when you consider that abysmal record, which only 29% of the American people approve of, according to the most recent poll, the weakest numbers since the Great Recession, when you consider all of that, actually, Russ Vought not wanting to testify in front of us makes some certain logical sense.
Congressman Brendan Boyle, no, it's going to be a busy weekend because MAGA Mike doesn't know what the hell he's doing and MAGA Republicans don't know what they're doing. But thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, always happy to. Take care.
Everybody hit subscribe. Let's get to 7 million subscribers. Thanks for watching.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.